Now, you've got a chapter on entertainment, and entertainment's how much it's used the UFO and alien subject in songs and in films, such as The Forbidden Planet in 1956, which is a very interesting film to analyse.
It is, yes.
And Close Encounters. And the film E.T., in which you make a very interesting claim, which is that Bill Cooper, he thought that the E.T. film was a retelling of a military story, and that it was based on a true story, which, and the boy in E.T. who meets the extraterrestrial, he is a metaphor for an Air Force officer who had been working with a real E.T. in captivity, if you like. That's what Bill Cooper claims.
That's right, and it's a very interesting account, which I heard, again, I think it was through Grant Cameron's website originally, that basically the story of the E.T. film, the 1980 Spielberg film, that was basically a true story, but as you say, the little boy wasn't the little boy in the real story, he was an Air Force officer, and Cooper told this account in 1989, and I think Spielberg had made some comments in the early 80s, soon after the film came out, but I haven't been able to trace those exact comments, but I'll get onto that in a minute. But so Cooper had said that a saucer had crashed in the late 1940s or early 1950s, I think in New Mexico somewhere, and they went out to the site and they found this alien walking around, and there were a couple of dead ones as well. And so the Air Force officer had to befriend this alien and pump it for information. And this went on for about 2 or 3 years. And eventually the alien died, according to Cooper, and they sent out a message, but before it died, to try and say to the extraterrestrials, come to the Earth because we've got your friend or your whatever, and we can't make him well. We need your help. And this was called Project Sigma, according to Cooper. But the curious thing is that in a 2011 interview, Steven Spielberg was interviewed by somebody called Quint. I don't know his real name, and I quote the audio in the book. The audio's online. I've got it in a trailer video that I made about the book. And Steven Spielberg says that he went to the White House with Nancy and Ronald Reagan present, and a few other people. He thinks Neil Armstrong might have even been there. And they showed the E.T. film. Spielberg was invited by Reagan to show the film. They showed the film.
It was in the White House screening room.
Yeah.
And Reagan got up to thank me for bringing the film to show him, to show the president, the first lady, and all of their guests, which included Sandra Day O'Connor in her first week as a justice in the Supreme Court, and it included some astronauts. I think Neil Armstrong was there. I'm not 100% certain, but it was an amazing evening. And he just stood up and he looked around the room, almost like he was doing a head count, and he said, "I want to thank you for bringing E.T. to the White House. We really enjoyed your movie." And then he looked around the room and he said, "And there are a number of people in this room who know that everything on that screen is absolutely true."
And Spielberg says that Reagan kind of said it as if it was a joke, but he wasn't laughing, and you could see that he was saying it as a serious remark. And he said that about 6 people in the room knew that it was true. So we have the 1989 Cooper story saying that the film is based on a true story, and we have Spielberg claiming in 2011 that that's what Reagan said. So I found that very interesting.
We are going to come on to some of the retrieval cases or alleged retrieval cases a little bit later. Right, I'll read another quote. As US Air Force NRO operative Sergeant Dan Morris, who sometimes used the name Dan Salter, stated in an interview with Stephen Greer, UFOs are both extraterrestrial and man-made. It is not that our government doesn't want us to know that there are people on other planets. What the people in power don't want us to know is that this free energy from energy generators developed with UFO technology is available to everybody. So secrecy about the UFO issue is because of the energy issue. When this knowledge is found out by the people, they will demand that our government release this technology and it will change the world. Just to reiterate, he's not mentioning weapons there.
No.
which we think it should be.
I think that a lot more researchers should be looking at that as an issue, because that's another way of having supremacy over other powers, is to have weapons technology at your disposal. So if you've got advanced energy technology and advanced weapons technology, then you're basically unassailable.
Now, in trying to get to the bottom of this issue, you use the term conventional evidence, which is what a scientist at a university would consider, or an organisation like SETI, who look at distant star systems to see if there's any planets like the Earth that might support life, or they look for signals. And that's all well and good, taking that hardline scientific approach. But tell us why you don't think that's good enough in order to actually get to the truth of this issue, just to go by this, what you would call conventional evidence.
Well, I mean, you essentially what you and I, when I get onto that part, I talk about my correspondence with Seth Shostak, for example, and I pointed out to Seth Shostak in an email in I think 2004. I sent this to him, and I got his response that Gordon Cooper, who was a Mercury astronaut, said that he filmed a flying saucer landing at Edwards Air Force Base in 1955, I think it was.
Just to interrupt you, Andrew. Seth Shostak, this article is published on space.com, so he would be considered a mainstream. Is he a scientist or a journalist?
He's a scientist, I believe,
right.
Yes. He worked for the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which was beaming out radio signals, receiving radio signals and then processing them to see if they had an artificial element to any of them.
Right, and at this current point in time, as far as they're concerned, there's been no contact with extraterrestrials. So you're pointing out to him the Gordon Cooper story. So
correct.
Continue.
Yeah, exactly. So going back to the conventional evidence is, we listen for these radio signals coming in. There's got to be civilizations out there sending these radio signals, so we'll read everything in, we'll process it in our computers, and we'll pick out the artificial signals. And that's the conventional approach. But if you've got a recognised military figure like Gordon Cooper, who's been in the space program, admittedly when this incident happened, he wasn't in the space program because it hadn't been started yet. When you've got him talking about this thing landing at Edwards Air Force Base, apparently under intelligent control, you should at least be interested in that as a person who is doing a project looking for extraterrestrial intelligence. But he just said, I'm not going to talk about that. He completely ignored it.
I can read his quote. So you've told him that there's testimony from an astronaut who was serving for many years, a trustworthy character, someone who's believed to be trustworthy by people like people in the mainstream.
Yeah.
And he's talking about a film of a UFO that landed and was documented at a US airbase. So Shostak replied to you in 2005. As for your suggestion that 1, we should believe testimony when it's given by astronauts, and 2, SETI should broaden its scope, I won't address the former, as it suggests that just because someone is trained to fly the space shuttle, their word is a substitute for objective scientific evidence. Right. So in other words, he's going to reject the testimony from anyone unless they're a scientist. That's what he's saying there. That's silly, and it's not science. As for 2, it is not SETI's mission to investigate claims of sightings of alien craft around the Earth. We do a different experiment, one that could be quickly checked by any number of observers and observatories. If I suggested that MUFON, for instance, should broaden its activities and do detailed radio searches of F through K star systems, would you think that a major desideratum? I suspect not. So he's saying we've got to ignore everyone unless they're a scientist, and he's saying that we're not going to use other people's methods. We're just going to use this one narrow method to try and prove or find out evidence.
That's essentially what he's saying. He's saying, I don't want to look at any other potential methods because this is the only method that I believe is valid to establish an answer to the question of whether extraterrestrial life has visited the Earth. Mm-hmm. And in fact, he's not even going to answer that question. He's really only interested in trying to answer a question of whether there is any evidence of an extraterrestrial civilization sending a signal out into space. He's limiting himself to that question. So, and this is often the way that mainstream academia works, is they will limit their scope of study deliberately and ignore anything which answers the question in another way.
Yeah, and just to stay on mainstream thinking, a classic debunking question, which is often used, you'll hear them say it all the time, is that, well, if an alien travels all the way, firstly, it's not possible to travel that far because you can't exceed the speed of light. That's the first thing they'll say. And then they'll say, well, they travel all this way and then their UFO crashes on the Earth, right? So, but we'll come on to that second point a bit later. But with regards to the assumption that they're traveling from another star, when I've looked at the UFO subject, I don't make that assumption.
No.
Right? I think there is certainly testimony. Now, you can question some of the hard evidence for there being non-human intelligence either on the planet or visiting the planet or on the planet in the past. And I like to leave it there. A non-human intelligence doesn't say where they're from, doesn't say how they get here, doesn't say whether they're even physical, right? Is there a non-human intelligence presence, right? We don't know how. It could be some completely unknown way that intelligence gets here. But is there a non-human intelligence that is interacting with the human race? That's a much broader question.
Yes.
Than is there a green man in a flying saucer that's setting off and for hundreds of light years, he goes into suspended animation and then makes his long journey here and then crashes his UFO, right? We're not saying that.
No.
Right?
No.
So the Earth is a massive place. If you look at the volume of the Earth, there's a lot of room inside the Earth. I don't know what's inside it. I've never been inside of the Earth. There's a lot of room in our own solar system. We don't know that there's not bases on other bodies in our own solar system. So that would counteract the argument for them travelling all that way. Because no scientist would argue that it's not possible to travel from another planet to our planet.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely. And that's, holding up this other book, Secrets in the Solar System, one might make that case that within this book there is evidence from our own space program which suggests that there is evidence of intelligent life within the solar system, or rather, perhaps I might say, the activities of intelligent life within the solar system. That's the case that I try and make in this book. And as you say, that then precludes the question of, well, they've come from a distant galaxy or a distant star system. They may not have come that far.
And I think the evidence in that book suggests largely that that's been in the past.
Yes.
Not necessarily now, although there may be evidence for now, but I think there's evidence of archaeology.
Yeah.
In the solar system.
Yeah. That's what I think.
There are a number of books being written about the Roswell incident, and you go into the Roswell incident because you think this is one case which is possibly evidence of a genuine non-human intelligence that has visited the Earth or got to the Earth somehow. So what books do you recommend and why?
Well, I actually mainly recommend the Paul Davies film, which was the 1994 TV movie called Roswell, which I think you can get on DVD off Amazon. It's an excellent summary, in my view, of the Roswell case, and some of it is dramatised to kind of smooth out the storytelling. But I think that based on what I've heard about the various witnesses, it covers their accounts very well. And I think that the other books that you can read are Don Smith's Witness to Roswell, where he's collected 600 witness accounts. I mean, by all means, of course, read Stanton Friedman's original book, Crash at Corona, from 1978, where he brought out some of the early details.
So let me just interrupt you. Unless you're going to read all those books and watch that film, and you're just going to read a little article on the BBC website and say, oh, it was just a psyop, it was a balloon, it was dummies, it was whatever, right? You can't debunk it unless you've looked at the information that Andrew's quoting here.
And what I highlight in the book, because I found it very, very intriguing, was the story of June Crane, which is one of the slightly lesser known cases.
Right. Well, before you do that, Andrew, what I'll do, I'm going to give a timeline of some of the key points of what happened at Roswell for those who don't know, and then you can tell me about June Crane. So on the 8th of July 1947, the Roswell Daily Record reported that the US Army had recovered pieces of a flying disc which had crashed on Mac Brazel's ranch at Corona near Roswell. Around the same time, UFOs and saucers had been seen in the area. On the 9th of July 1947, the US Army changed its story, stating the debris recovered was only a weather balloon. Over time, many more witnesses came forward and spoke of there being 2 crash sites, recovery of living and dead bodies, recovery of unusual pieces of metal, such as the impervious but light and flexible memory metal, which returned to its original shape after being scrunched or folded up, and it was impossible to cut, I think, as well.
Yes.
Witnesses stated the debris and bodies were flown to Wright Field, Ohio, now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Defense Secretary James Forrestal was involved in the events and is said to have communicated with one or more of the aliens from the crashed craft. One of the aliens survived until 1954. So that's a basic, simple summary of of what happened. So tell us about this lady.
So one of the things that is there is this alleged memory metal, or the metal that was very light and then, returned to its sort of flat shape when you scrunched it up or cut it or tried to cut it or bent it. And there, David Rudiak has a site called Roswell Proof, and I recommend people visit that site because I think he's got about 20 accounts of people who apparently handled this morphing metal, one of which is June Crane, and I go into some detail in the book because there is an audio recording of an interview with her by James Clarkson, and that was published, I think, in the early 2000s, and James Clarkson was a former police detective, and again, that's an account, for example, that is recorded, as I said. So, for example, you could get Peter Hyatt or a statement analyst to look at it and detect deception. But certainly in listening to that account and the way she describes it, there is no reason for that woman to have told a lie about handling this memory metal. It didn't serve her interest. She didn't want to tell the story at first. In fact, she came and saw a lecture by James Clarkson, I think in 95 or 96. And then the Air Force produced this final report on Roswell in 1997, and June Crane knew that what was in that report was a lie, and she had some health problems at that time, and she decided to go forward to James Clarkson and tell him what she knew about this metal, about who showed her a sample of it, and she worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at the time as a secretary, a very competent and well-respected secretary who could get jobs done, and she was shown this metal by an officer, and I think she was also told about bodies being taken there as well, as I recall. But what struck me about her account was this account of the memory metal. So I suggest that people read those accounts, and maybe they will conclude, as I have concluded, that yes, they did recover debris. Yes, it was debris which didn't look like anything that was in development by the US Air Force or any other terrestrial air force at the time. Therefore, where did it come from?
And what about the claims of the extraterrestrials, live and dead?
Yeah, I mean,
or non-human beings, let's just call them that.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that a couple of times in the book. I don't give a lot of details about that. But again, people will claim that those stories came out later, which might be true. And I mentioned, for example, the testimony of Walter G. Haut, who was the Roswell press secretary. And initially, when he came out with his story, he didn't talk about having seen alien bodies. But again, as he approached the end of his life, he did write out an affidavit. But this, I think, wasn't released until about 3 or 4 or 5 years after he died. And he said that he'd been into a hangar and he'd witnessed the bodies, and that was in his signed affidavit. And again, I go into the criticism of that affidavit in the book, because some people have criticised it because it wasn't all written down at the same time or something. And so I'm aware of the criticism of that. But overall, his account, based on some of the others' accounts, based on that evidence, I have concluded that yes, a disc did crash at Roswell, or at least one, maybe two, and that bodies were recovered, and that those materials and bodies were taken away and studied. They went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's a name that comes up more than once, not just in the Roswell case, it comes up in other cases as well.
And just to address the question of, well, why the hell would it crash? One explanation given is that there was an experimental radar system which was very powerful,
yes,
and putting out electromagnetic waves into the air, and obviously the propulsion system of such a disk is not using wings or aerodynamics. It's using something which is possibly affected by magnetics or electromagnetic waves. So
Right.
I think Stanton Friedman has suggested this, that it may have been affected by some experimental radar system. And then possibly after they've realised this, they've then developed a weapon system for it.
Yes, and I mean this idea of using some, because radar technology is based on microwaves. You're sending out microwave beams. So this then ties into perhaps later use of the technology to, for example, eventually develop things like the active denial system for crowd control. And also there is some evidence that microwaves played some kind of role in the destruction of the World Trade Center. So you can see just on it in a general way that there may be a line of development which takes you from the events near Roswell, right through to 9/11 potentially. Again, I'm skipping out and skipping over a lot of things and whatnot, but you can see that potential there, I think.
And we have another crash not far from there in 1948, alleged, the Aztec, 25th of March 1948, a place called Aztec, which is not far from the Roswell incident. And I think Stanton Friedman has suggested that, well, why are the craft appearing there in this one place? And he suggests that that's where there was nuclear research going on that there may have been concern about. He doesn't know that, we don't know that, but he just puts that as a hypothesis. So what about this one?
Yeah, that's a great investigation. I read the book that I read was by Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. They've written a couple of books actually. I think one was published in 2015, and that's the book that I read. I think it's just called The Aztec Incident. And that incident actually first came out in 1950 in Frank Scully's book, which was I think called Behind the UFOs. And it involved a chap called Silas Newton, who was quite a wealthy businessman. In the 1950s, there was a concerted effort to actually portray Silas Newton as a con man who was trying to con the government out of money because he had this device which could detect magnetic anomalies, and this had come from some type of UFO crash or something. But that whole story was essentially muddled together from what actually happened. And Scott and Suzanne Ramsey go into that in the book, how this story was developed and what originally happened. And they, for example, discovered this road in the middle of the desert, which they would state, based on the evidence they've collected, that this road was used to recover a crashed disc which had made, it wasn't like a catastrophic crash, it was like a forced landing. The disc had made a forced landing and like crashed into some rocks. And the occupants were killed. They've got witnesses. They went up to the craft, they opened the door, they went inside, they found the bodies, and then gradually they built up the evidence that yes, this disc had been recovered. This was when they built this road. The road is still there, you can go and find it. They found some concrete slabs which had been put on the road, which they think were to allow the crane to be put down so that they could lift this thing onto a truck. And they said
that's still there now.
That road is still there.
So
and
there's
that
no
slab is still
explanation
there.
for this road and concrete blocks
in the middle of the desert. You know, there's no settlement there. There's no mine that's known of or anything like that. And you know, all that he goes into in the book in quite a lot of detail. He also talks about we talked about the radar. Now there was this claim that maybe this was brought down by radar, and I forget how he includes it in his account, but they said they came across this account that there was a radar base somewhere in that area, and they went around, but there's no Air Force base there. There is no Air Force base that would have built a radar facility. So everyone said, no, that's rubbish. There was no radar facility there because there's no air base. Why would they want to build a radar facility? But they kept on researching, and eventually they found that there was a radar base constructed there in the late 1940s, probably 47, maybe early 48. But the Air Force, it wasn't built for the Air Force, it was for Los Alamos National Laboratories, because it was built during the time, maybe it was the early 40s actually, I've got the date wrong, but it was built during the time that Los Alamos was working on the atomic bomb. and they needed to make sure that there were no enemy aircraft flying towards Los Alamos where they were doing the research. So they built this radar facility, but it wasn't for the Air Force. It was built for Los Alamos, and they found the site. You know, they went and they found where all the generators were installed, and they found the documents which showed that yes, this radar base had been built. So they worked through the story, and all the things that they told were not true about the case. A lot of them turned out that they actually were true, and they were able to find the evidence that they were true. So I came to the conclusion from their research, having studied it, that yes, indeed, a flying saucer disc crashed at Aztec in 1948, and a cover-up was done, and they did a better job of covering that crash up than they did of covering the Roswell crash up, because they were 6 months down the line and they'd learnt lessons from what happened with the Roswell case.
And you discussed a number of other cases. So there was 2 cases in a place called Socorro, one in 1964, and Kecksburg in 1965, Shag Harbor in 1967, the Berwyn Mountains case in 1974, and I've made a film about that. You can watch it from this link. And the Rendlesham Forest case of 1980. So you mentioned that at the beginning, and I am going to be producing something hopefully quite soon with regards statement analysis of some of the witnesses. Do you want to say anything about Rendlesham in this interview?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you can read what I put in the book. Again, the chapter that you mentioned, it's quite short, but the point being that I recommend some of the literature you can read. For example, the Georgina Bruni book about the Rendlesham case, the Scott Ramsey book about Aztec, etc., etc. There's you can read the Chris Stiles book about the Shag Harbor incident from '67, where this craft went into the sea and divers went down to it whilst it was underwater. And then, I know I'm going back to this case, but I just wanted to mention briefly a bit about it. And then this craft moved, and it was observed for a period of about 2 days. Eventually it was, I think, observed for a period of time off the coast of Canada by the Canadian Navy, and it was observed for many hours under the water. And very few people are aware of this case. But going back to the Rendlesham case, you know, we'll probably have another conversation about this in the future, but, you know, there's been this, was it an alien craft or was it something else that landed? I think it's clear that something happened in the forest, something landed. There are a number of witnesses to that. But what actually landed and who it was owned by, whether it was an alien craft or not, I think that's the contentious issue, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's interesting that you said that the Navy tracked a UFO under the water.
Yeah.
Right? And obviously with the Aztec and the Roswell cases, if they hadn't been taken down somehow, possibly by radar, then they're just a dot in the sky. So people always ask the question, well, come on, if there's UFOs, everyone's got a high definition camera in their pocket these days. There would be pictures all over the internet of UFOs. So if we can just address that question, I don't think that that there's regular interaction or as regular as is claimed, right? But the first people to detect such incursions of either the ocean or the airspace is going to be the armed forces, and they're the ones running the radar systems. And we've got many reports of that in the Disclosure Project. I've had radar operators come to me in my lectures and tell me what they've seen, and they've been told not to speak about it, the right angle turns and impossible dynamics, etc. So do you just want to make a comment on the fact that there seems to be a lack of video evidence?
Yeah, I think certainly close-up evidence is rare, and as you say, it seems that some of these craft are wise to what's going on with our military forces, and they do steer clear a lot of the time. But as you say, the military are going to be able to detect these things. They're going to detect some. Disclosure Project witnesses state that they can be tracked right out into space, from the Earth, so they can see them coming from a long way off. So they're going to be able to take action to put a cover-up in place, almost before anybody on the ground sees anything.
Well, there's the very interesting testimony of Michael Smith, where he gets a call. He's working, I'm not sure if he was working at NORAD or he had to telephone NORAD. No, I think he was working at a radar system that was in communication with NORAD, and they contacted him and they warned him that there was a UFO coming down. Could he make sure that there's no aircraft in the vicinity because there's a UFO coming
Yep.
coming along that they had no control over.
And he says they told him not to write anything down, don't log it, just,
Yeah.
this is just
So
happening.
yeah. Now we don't know whether that was an extraterrestrial craft or whether it could have been a secret.
aircraft,
It could have been a secret vehicle. Now you do mention some video evidence in your book. So you talk about NASA's own video evidence.
Oh yeah.
So just speak about that.
Well, I mean, again, anyone can look at what a good film to watch on that is the David Sereda analysis, which is called Evidence, the Case for NASA UFOs. That's on YouTube, I think, and it's quite old now. It's about, I think it's almost 20 years old. But he looks at several missions, for example, the STS-48 mission, the STS-80 mission, and the STS-75, the so-called tether incident, which are all space shuttle missions. Films all come from NASA. And to my knowledge, certainly in parts or more than one part of these clips, these are showing intelligently controlled craft. The one, I think it's STS-48, which was the one where this beam is apparently fired and the craft shoots off in a different direction. Questions were asked about that in the US Congress at the time. And Jack Kasher, who was a PhD physicist, he wrote about that. And, I think I discussed that in the Secret Space Program book, actually, in this book. So these three books that I mentioned in there are kind of almost a trilogy focusing around these subjects. But it is clear that NASA do have it's clear to me at least, that NASA do have some video evidence of intelligently controlled craft operating near the Earth.
That are not claimed to belong to NASA.
Yeah, yeah.